The guard's hand had already closed around my wrist when the throne room doors slammed open on their own. I want to be clear that I had not planned for it to go this far. I had wanted, 3 weeks earlier, exactly one thing out of my life at Ashvale Castle, to get the ovens through the winter without the bread cracking. I had not wanted a trial. I had not wanted the whole court staring at my flour, stained apron, while a duke's daughter smiled at me the way a cat smiles at something it has already decided is dinner. But there is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a throne room right before something impossible happens, and I had learned in 3 short weeks to recognize it. Somewhere behind the king's chair, something small and white and entirely unbothered by protocol was about to make a liar out of everyone who had underestimated me. Let me tell you how a rabbit put me here. It started 5 weeks before any of that, on an ordinary Tuesday, with my hands in dough up to the wrist and absolutely no interest in the crown of Ashvale. I was 23, an oven apprentice under a head cook named Hollis, who had opinions about yeast the way other people had opinions about gods, and I had been in that kitchen since I was 11, which meant I had long since stopped noticing the castle above us as anything but the reason the flour bill got paid. I noticed the king the way I noticed weather, present, occasionally inconvenient. None of my business. King Torvald ruled the iron wolves of Ashvale with the kind of unbothered authority that made rooms rearrange themselves before he entered them, which I had heard about often and witnessed exactly twice, both times from the servants' gallery, both times unimpressed. He was, by every account that mattered to the court, the strongest wolf in 3 territories and entirely uninterested in marrying any of the women lined up to prove otherwise. What the court did not know, what almost no one below the 4th floor knew, was that for 6 months running, someone in the royal household had been quietly requesting an extra dried apple tart from the ovens every Sunday. Burnt at the edges the way I liked mine, and no one else did, sent up without a name attached. Hollis assumed it was Osric, the king's second, who had a sweet tooth he pretended not to have. I did not think much about it either way. A tart is a tart. I had seen the king himself exactly twice before that Tuesday, both times from the servants' gallery during a winter feast. And both times I had come away with the same unremarkable impression: a large, composed man who filled a room the way weather fills a valley, entirely without effort. I had not thought about him since. I had, if I am honest, thought considerably more about whether the rye was overproofed than about anything happening 4 floors above my head. And I would like the record to reflect that this remained true right up until the exact moment it stopped being true. The court, that season, was occupied with a different kind of weather entirely. The low, persistent thunder of a king well past the age his advisers thought proper for remaining unmarried. Lady Cressida had been the presumed answer to that thunder for the better part of a year. Not because Torvald had shown her any particular favour, but because her father's house was old, her manners were flawless, and no one else had bothered to put forward a competing name. I had heard the gossip about her the way I heard gossip about everything happening above the kitchens, at a comfortable distance, mildly, the way you hear rain on a roof you are not standing under. The Hare ceremony was announced the week the frost came early. It was old law, older than the current dynasty, half forgotten and mostly ignored for 2 generations because no Ashvale king had triggered it. Somewhere in a king's blood, alongside the wolf, lived a second, rarer thing, a marrow hare, a small bonded creature that surfaced exactly once in a king's lifetime. At the moment his fated mate first crossed his path, whether he noticed her or not. The old law said whoever caught the hare, when it finally showed itself, would be recognised as queen, because the hare did not answer to politics. It answered to whatever the king's own instinct had already decided, and never told him. Torvald's had never surfaced. Until, apparently, it had. The court assumed this meant a ceremony, a courtyard full of eligible noblewomen, the hare released among them, the catching a formality that would confirm what everyone already believed, which was that Lady Cressida, daughter of Duke Aldrich, was the obvious answer to a question no one had bothered asking properly. I heard, afterward, how the ceremony actually went, from 3 separate kitchen boys who had watched it from the wall and could not stop laughing long enough to tell it in order. The Hare had been released with appropriate solemnity in the centre of the courtyard before 24 assembled noblewomen in their finest, and had responded to this solemnity by ignoring every one of them entirely. It hopped once toward Lady Cressida, close enough that she had already begun composing her victory face, then veered at the last possible moment and buried itself instead in the skirts of an elderly dowager who screamed loudly enough to startle half the pigeons off the east tower. It emerged from the dowager, sat for a long moment surveying the assembled cream of Ashvale nobility with what one kitchen boy swore was open disdain, and then bolted for the servants' passage at a dead sprint, ears back, as though the entire courtyard had personally offended it. I was in the kitchens that morning with my sleeves pushed up and a batch of rye rising badly, half listening to the shouting from the courtyard through the open servants' door, when something small and white came through that door instead, moving like it had somewhere specific to be. It went straight past me, circled the flour barrel twice, and then, with the particular unbothered confidence of a creature that has never once been told no, leapt directly into my arms, and went still, tucked under my chin like it had lived there its whole life. I stood there, floured to the elbow, holding what I would later learn was the physical proof of 6 generations of royal superstition, and thought, with real annoyance, that I did not have time for this. The guards found me a minute later. Behind them came half the courtyard, including a duke's daughter whose face had gone the particular white of someone doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to, and behind all of them, walking faster than I had ever seen a king walk, came Torvald himself. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, flour to the elbow, rye dough drying on my hands. A rabbit tucked under my chin that by every old law in his kingdom had just declared me his intended, and said the single stupidest sentence I have ever heard a grown man say. That is not possible. I would agree with you, I said, except it appears to have already happened. Something moved behind his eyes that I did not understand yet, and would spend the next 3 weeks learning to read. It was not the look of a man pleased with a joke fate had played on him. It was closer to the look of a man who had just watched his own certainty about the shape of his life quietly fall over. The Hare, for its part, burrowed further into my collar and refused to acknowledge that anyone else in the room existed. I did not understand yet how strange this was going to get. I only understood that Hollis had gone very pale, that Lady Cressida had gone very still, and that I was going to have to finish that rye some other day. I was brought before the throne that same afternoon, still in my apron, because no one had thought to let me change, and formally presented as the one recognised by the Marrow Hare. An announcement that landed on the assembled court like a dropped tray of crockery. The great hall at Ashvale was not built with kitchen apprentices in mind. I felt every inch of that as I walked its length with flour still ghosting the backs of my hands, past nobles who had dressed for a ceremony that had not gone the way any of them expected. Their faces doing the particular polite work of trying not to stare and failing entirely. The Hare rode against my collarbone the whole way, apparently unbothered by the several hundred years of protocol it had just upended, and I found its calm considerably more useful than my own, which had mostly abandoned me somewhere around the second hallway. There must be an error, Cressida said, before the herald had even finished speaking, in a voice pitched to carry. The creature is an animal. Animals can be lured. I would ask the court to consider whether a kitchen girl familiar with the smell of grain might not have simply attracted it, deliberately, with scraps, to force a claim above her station. It was, I will admit, a reasonably clever accusation, in that it was almost impossible to disprove and cost her nothing to make. Torvald's jaw did something complicated. Osric, standing at his shoulder, looked like a man doing very difficult math about how many ways this could go wrong for everyone in the room. An inquiry will be held, Torvald said finally, to the whole hall, in the tone of a man buying himself time to think. Until it concludes, no claim is confirmed. Wonderful, I said, mostly to myself, and only realised after that half the front row had heard me. The inquiry gave the court 3 weeks to decide whether fate or fraud had put a rabbit in my arms, and gave Cressida 3 weeks to make sure the answer came out the way she wanted. She did not waste any of them. Within 2 days, formal witnesses had been summoned to testify to my supposed familiarity with attractant baking practices, which was, Hollis informed me flatly, not a real category of baking and never had been. Within a week, my movements around the kitchens were being tracked by a steward reporting directly to the Duke's household, ostensibly in the name of thoroughness. I was called before the inquiry panel myself on the 6th day, 3 robed magistrates and a scribe in a cold side chamber that smelled of old wax, and asked to account for every hour of the week the Hare had chosen me. I answered honestly, which was somehow worse than lying would have been, because the honest answer was almost insultingly dull. I had been proofing dough. I had been arguing with Hollis about salt. I had been asleep. The magistrates seemed personally offended that fate had chosen someone with so little of interest to confess, and Cressida, watching from the gallery with her hands folded, looked like a woman recalculating her strategy in real time, rather than abandoning it. I kept working. I did not know what else a person in my position was meant to do with a rabbit that would not leave her side, and a duke's daughter who wanted her gone. Torvald came to the kitchens himself on the 4th night of the inquiry, which no king in the history of Ashville had apparently ever done for a reason that was not food. "I am told you are being difficult with the investigators," he said, standing in my doorway like a man who had rehearsed an entrance and immediately forgotten the rest of the plan. "I am told the investigators are asking me whether I seasoned my bread with love magic," I said. I found that difficult to answer politely. He almost smiled. I watched him decide not to. "This is not a joke to my court." "It is not a joke to me either," I said, and set down my knife long enough to look at him properly. "I did not ask your rabbit to pick me. I did not ask for guards at my door or a duke's daughter deciding I am a fraud before anyone has heard a single fact. I have spent 12 years in this kitchen because it was mine, and it asked nothing of me but good bread. I would very much like it back." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal edge. "I do not understand it either," he admitted. "The Hare has never surfaced. I did not know I had one. I do not know why it chose this moment, or you, and I confess that not understanding my own instincts is not a sensation I enjoy." "Welcome to being a person with a body," I said, and this time he did smile, briefly, like a man surprised by his own face. He did not leave after that, which surprised me more than his arriving had. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, then, unasked, came and sat on the low stool by the ovens that Hollis usually reserved for the youngest apprentice, looking entirely too large for it. "You are not what I expected," he said, "from a woman the court has spent a week calling a fraud." "What did you expect?" "I am not certain. Someone frightened, perhaps. Someone eager to explain herself out of trouble." He turned a wooden spoon over in his hands, without seeming to notice he had picked it up. "You have explained nothing. You have simply told me, twice now, that you would like your kitchen back. It is the truest thing I have to say. I went back to my dough because my hands needed something to do that was not looking at him. I did not grow up wanting a crown, Your Grace. I grew up wanting the ovens to hold their heat through February. I am not going to pretend to want the first thing simply because your rabbit decided I should have it." "Torvald," he said. "What?" "My name. You keep calling me by the title, and I find I would rather you did not, given the circumstances." He set the spoon down, carefully, the way I would come to recognize as a habit, every object he touched around me. He touched like it might break if he was not careful, as though he had decided, somewhere without telling anyone, that carefulness was the only gift he knew how to give. "I do not know what to do with a thing I did not choose and cannot argue with. My wolf has never surfaced past its own shape in my lifetime. I did not know I carried a second creature at all until it walked out of me and into your arms in front of half my court. That makes two of us who did not choose this, I said. I would still like it on the record that I did not smell of grain on purpose. He laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised out of him, and I understood, watching it happen, that it was probably the first time all week anyone in that castle had made him do it without meaning to flatter him. If you want to find out whether Cressida's inquiry actually succeeded in taking my kitchen and my name away from me, and what the Hare did the day it finally mattered most, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king's own instinct refuses to be talked out of what it already knows. It was Hollis, 3 days later, who found the ledger. We were pulling old provisioning records to prove I had never once requisitioned extra stores beyond my ration. The kind of dull defensive work an inquiry makes necessary, when she stopped on a page and went very quiet. "Someone's been sending extra flour and dried apples to the east ovens," she said. "Weekly, 6 months running. Unmarked requisition, paid from the privy purse." She turned the ledger toward me. "That is the king's own hand, girl." I looked at the entries. Every Sunday, for half a year, a small, quiet allowance of flour and apples, routed to my exact oven. In handwriting I recognised now from the inquiry papers Torvald had signed himself. Long before any Hare, long before any ceremony, someone had noticed that my ovens ran thin some weeks and had quietly made certain they did not, and had never once mentioned it, and had let Osric take the blame for a sweet tooth that was never his. I sat with that ledger a long time. I thought about every burnt-edge tart that had gone up to the royal table with no name attached, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that his instinct had not chosen me the day the Hare ran into my kitchen. It had chosen me months before, quietly, in the only language a king too proud to examine his own feelings would allow himself to speak, and the Hare had simply been the first part of him too honest to keep pretending otherwise. Something in me that had been treating this whole ordeal as an inconvenient joke stopped being amused. I closed that ledger and understood, plainly, that I intended to keep what was mine, the kitchen, the truth, and whatever this apparently already was, and that I was done letting Cressida decide the shape of my own life for me. I did not tell Torvald what I had found. Some things a woman keeps until the moment they will matter most. Cressida's second move came the night before the inquiry's final ruling, and very nearly worked. A steward found, in my personal stores, a small paper twist of dried bellhollow root, a hothouse herb that grows nowhere near a working kitchen, that turns a man's supper into a slow and ugly poisoning if enough of it steeps in a broth. It was discovered, conveniently, during a search ordered in Cressida's own name, tucked exactly where a steward would be sure to look. And by morning the accusation had changed from fraud to attempted regicide. I was arrested before breakfast. That is the scene I told you about at the very start of this, the guard's hand on my wrist. The doors of the throne room slamming open on something no one had planned for. Hollis had tried to stop the guards at the kitchen door, shouting that she had inventoried those stores herself not 3 days prior and the bellhollow had not been there, and had been shouldered aside for her trouble. Osric arrived at a run, still fastening his own collar, having been woken by a steward too frightened of the word regicide to wait for morning. By the time I was walked through the corridor toward the throne room, half the household staff had lined the passage to watch, and not one of them was silent about what they thought of it. I stood before the throne with my hands bound and understood, with total clarity, that Cressida had just handed me the one piece of proof I actually needed. "Bellhollow root grows in exactly one greenhouse in this kingdom," I said, before the herald had finished reading the charge. Loud enough to carry to the back wall. Duke Aldrich's greenhouse. It does not grow wild. It does not grow in a kitchen garden. Someone brought it into my stores from somewhere it has never once been kept, and there is only one household in Ashvale that keeps it at all. The hall went the particular kind of silent that precedes either violence or history. Cressida opened her mouth to answer, and that was the moment the marrow hair, which had been curled against Osric's boot the entire proceeding, sat up, crossed the floor of the throne room at a dead sprint, and leapt directly into the folds of Cressida's skirts, emerging a heartbeat, later dragging a single dropped glove that still carried, unmistakably, the pale green stain of crushed bell hollow leaf. No one in that hall had a story ready for a rabbit solving a poisoning. Cressida found her voice a moment too late. Some thin protest about the glove being stolen, planted against her the same as the herb had supposedly been planted against me, but the greenhouse steward summoned to testify had already gone the colour of old parchment, and would not meet her eyes, and that told the room everything the glove had not. Torvald rose from his throne, looking between the glove, the ledger of accusations, and the woman he had spent 3 weeks quietly, uncomfortably, thoroughly falling for. "Release her," he said, and his voice did not shake at all. Cressida was stripped of her father's standing at court that same hour. Her greenhouse searched within the day, and the bell hollow found there matched down to the leaf. She left Ashvale before the week was out, and word came later that Duke Aldrich had not troubled himself to accompany her. I did not watch her go. I was still standing in the throne room with my wrists newly unbound, rubbing the feeling back into them, when Hollis pushed through the crowd and folded me into a hug that smelled of yeast and relief in equal measure, muttering something about how she had told the steward those stores were clean and no one had listened to a cook about her own kitchen, which she considered, on the whole, a far greater injustice than the poisoning charge itself. Torvald found me in the kitchens that evening, where all the true things between us had happened, holding a burnt-edged tart he had clearly baked himself and badly. "I did not know how to give this to you honestly," he said, "so I have been sending it dishonestly for 6 months instead." "I know," I said. Hollis found the ledger. He set the tart down, carefully, the way I had watched him set down everything all week whenever he did not trust his own hands. I am done being a coward about it. I do not fully understand what my own instinct decided months before I did. I only know I am no longer interested in arguing with it. "Then stop," I said, "and tell me properly." He did. It was not eloquent. It was not the kind of declaration a court poet would have written for him. It was a king standing in a kitchen with flour on his sleeves, telling a woman he had loved her quietly and clumsily for half a year before either of them had a name for it, and it was, without question, the finest thing anyone had ever said to me in that room. When he kissed me, it was careful and a little uncertain, like a man who had never once let himself believe he was allowed something this simple, and I found I did not want to correct his uncertainty so much as keep it, exactly as it was, for as long as he would let me. He claimed me before the full court 3 days later, in the same hall where I had stood bound and accused, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had once assumed Cressida's name, was the only one that belonged there. It cost him. 2 houses withdrew in quiet protest at a queen who had come up through the ovens rather than a bloodline, and Osric spent a fortnight managing whispers that a king ruled by a rabbit was a king ruled by nothing at all. Torvald did not apologise for any of it. He said plainly to anyone who asked that his instinct had known what was good for his kingdom a full 6 months before his pride caught up to it, and that he trusted the Hare's judgment considerably more than he trusted a court that had nearly let an innocent woman hang for a poisoning she never committed. The kiss, when it finally happened, was not in front of the court at all. It came after, in the kitchens, once the crowns and the ceremony and the 2 withdrawn houses had all gone quiet for the night, careful, unhurried, a man kissing a woman like he still could not quite believe he was allowed to. And I found I did not want to hurry him out of that disbelief. Something in my chest that had been braced since a rabbit first ran through the wrong door simply set itself down and stayed. The great hall took longer to settle than either of us did. Whispers followed me through it for weeks. A queen who smelled faintly of yeast even in her finest gowns, a king who had let an animal choose his wife. And I let them run their course the way bread lets a crust form, because arguing with gossip has never once made a loaf rise faster. 6 months later, I stood in that same kitchen with a letter from my mother in one hand and a burnt edge tart cooling on the sill in the other, the marrow hare asleep in a basket by the hearth, like it had never once been the proof of 6 generations of royal superstition and not just an ordinary, deeply spoiled rabbit. My mother's letter said the village had heard the story 3 different ways by the time it reached her, and asked, carefully, whether it was true her daughter now ran the royal ovens. I wrote back that I ran considerably more than the ovens, and that she should come see for herself before the frost made the roads impossible. Hollis had 2 new apprentices under her, and complained about both of them constantly, which I had long since learned to recognise as her version of affection. Osric had stopped flinching every time the court brought up rabbits in polite conversation, mostly, and the castle, once so certain that a queen had to arrive already wearing a crown, had quietly gotten used to the idea that mine had come to me covered in flour. I picked up the tart, burnt exactly the way I liked it, and thought about the woman who had stood in this kitchen 5 weeks earlier with dough on her hands and absolutely no interest in the throne above her. She had no idea, that ordinary Tuesday, that the shape of her whole life was about to change because a rabbit came through the wrong door. She only knew she intended to finish her bread. I like to think she would have laughed if you had told her how it ended. Do you think the hare truly chose me at random that first morning, or had it been waiting for its moment the whole 6 months the tarts were already being sent? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay in this kitchen a little longer, comment the hare and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing in this ridiculous, wonderful kitchen with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Ashvale. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills whose own instincts know something they have not caught up to yet, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.